President Putin and President Zelensky are going to have to get together because you know what? We want to stop killing millions of people. You have young soldiers being killed. If you saw the pictures that I saw of the battlefield from satellite, you've never seen any pictures like that. Soldiers are being killed by the thousands a week, thousands of soldiers a week. As we speak, they're being killed. That's why I want to see a ceasefire and I want to get the deal done.
Welcome back to Sunday Night in America. One way to end the killing is for Russia to get out of Ukraine. Stop the invasion. Go back to your communist homes. Time does not alter the reality. Russia invaded Ukraine and savagery ensued. Russia bombed hospitals and escape routes. Russia hit power grids, kidnapped Ukrainian children, paraded nude female POWs through the streets, the stuff of Hamas or the Taliban. But it's Russia. U.S. officials continue peace talks in Saudi Arabia while General Keith Kellogg met with President Zelensky in Ukraine. Zelensky made clear the U.S. is a great friend, but he's worried about the change in tone. It's probably best to praise in public and critique in private. The Million Dialogue echoes through history for a reason. It's a reminder that being weak doesn't mean you aren't right. Power doesn't equal the truth. The powerless look to the strong for help. Yes, Europe should step up and do more. Yes, the U.S. has done a lot already. Yes, the U.S. twice liberated Europe at great expense in life and blood and money. That's the burden of being the most powerful country in the world. But Putin poisons opponents, and he throws critics off buildings, and he kills dissenters in prison, and he takes Americans hostage for prisoner exchanges. And that sounds like a war criminal. Joining us is former Senior Director at the National Security Council, Rob Greenway, and former Deputy National Security Advisor, Victoria Coates. Welcome to you both. Victoria, the narrative seems to have shifted. A year and a half ago, people were complaining that Biden was not supplying enough to Ukraine to help them. I mean, Russia invaded Ukraine. Trump says it never would have happened on his watch, which tells me it was wrong for it to happen at all. Why is the narrative shifting?
Well, Trey, good to be with you. And hi, Rob. I think what we're seeing here, and we'll be marking tomorrow the 3-year anniversary of this invasion, is simply the fact of the matter that the battlefield is shifting. And, you know, everyone was amazed in the spring of 2022 when the Ukrainians fought back and started to gain some momentum. I think in hindsight, that was probably the moment for some kind of more decisive action to push Putin back. But the problem, Trey, is we wind up in a math situation here where Putin is going to have more soldiers to throw at this than the Ukrainians are. So we need to get, as the president said, to a negotiated settlement before we're fighting down to the last Ukrainian. So I think he is right to try to strike this deal for potentially some natural resource exchange with the Ukrainians to sort of pay back the U.S. taxpayer. But no one's talking about abandoning Ukraine right now.
Rob, did Victoria put her finger on probably what needs to be negotiated out, which is mineral rights to reimburse the U.S.? Is that kind of the sticking point as you see it?
Well, it's great to be with both of you. I think that's exactly right. I think President Trump campaigned and received his approval in part to end this conflict. I think he's doing 3 important things. First is he's initiated negotiations. He's brought Putin to the table. Second, he's reaching out to a broad constituency of involved parties. Third, he's recognized the tie between the economic and the security. The partnership makes the rationale for the other. If we can conclude a deal with the Ukrainians on minerals and other economic elements, it'll make the relationship more strong. It'll also make them more economically viable now and after a conflict. Perhaps the most important thing President Trump and his team are doing is making this about U.S. strategic interests and the relationship between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, not just the conflict in Ukraine. Our interests are larger. The scope of the conflict is larger for us, and resolving it, I think, is integral to the president's approach, and I think it's heartening to see. I'd also add that it's a little disingenuous for critics that haven't been able to get to the peace negotiation table in the last 3 years to criticize this before it even takes shape.
All right, Victoria, I want to pick up on something Rob said. Reports are that China will join the talks in Saudi Arabia. If China is our adversary, why bring them in, and will Ukraine be present in those talks?
Well, I think that's to be determined by the concerned parties. And President Trump and Secretary Rubio were both very clear that when the discussions are focused on Ukraine, that Ukraine should be part of those conversations. But China's presence in this conflict is something I think most Americans aren't picking up on. And bear in mind, we have North Korean shock troops present in Russia pushing back against Ukraine's initiative into Russia. There's no reason for the North Koreans to have wandered into Russia. The only reason they're there is if China permitted it. And then we also have Chinese supposedly commercial vessels dragging their anchors across the Baltic Sea, disrupting the internet cables of NATO allies like the Baltics and Finland. That's not natural behavior either. And then finally, we're getting some increasingly credible reporting that Chinese state-owned entities are moving into the parts of Ukraine that Russia is occupying in the east to do reconstruction. If that is real, that is China kind of trying to do what in the communist Chinese totalitarian way, what President Trump is trying to do in the more capitalist free market effort with Ukraine. They're trying to create vested economic interests in that zone. I think both the Russians and the Ukrainians in the east will learn pretty quickly they can be a harsh taskmistress. But I think that all shows us that China is very much inserting itself into this conflict.
Rob, there's been some talk lately about Ukraine and the failure to have elections. Let me ask you about Russia. Does Russia have free and fair elections? If we're critiquing democracies around the world, how would you judge Russia?
Yeah, I think not only the outcome bad, I think we have a righteous argument against the process. In no way would I consider them necessarily to be a peaceful democratic state. I don't think it's to our advantage to treat them that way. However, we have to recognize the reality of who's in charge. And again, I think that the approach to get Putin to the table is going to be a long and painful one, but it's more progress than we've seen the last 3 years. And I think at least we ought to give it a chance to take shape before we recognize exactly which direction it's going to go.
I agree with both of you. I am glad to see settlement talks. I don't know who wins wars. You have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people that are being killed, and I'd love to see a negotiated settlement. Love to see it without ceding territory, but if territory needs to be ceded, we'll see what comes out of Saudi Arabia. Thank you both for joining us on the Sunday night and loaning us your expertise.
Thank you, Trey.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you both.